It is June 11th, 1962. Picture this.
Okay, I am picturing it.
You are trapped on a freezing rock in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. You are completely surrounded by the churning, shark-patrolled, deadly waters of the Pacific Ocean.
Not exactly a vacation spot.
Not at all. But you possess a genius-level IQ of 133. You have a handful of stolen cafeteria spoons, a discarded vacuum cleaner motor, and absolutely nothing but time.
Which is a very dangerous combination, as we'll see.
Right. So the question is, how do you beat the most heavily funded, technologically advanced, and psychologically brutal fortress in American history?
That is the ultimate question.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are pulling you into the ultimate game of cat and mouse. It is a clash of titans, really.
Yeah, but not between two people.
Exactly. Not between two people, but between raw, desperate human ingenuity and an impenetrable, unforgiving structure. We are obsessively investigating this whole genius versus fortress dynamic today.
And we're doing that by tearing apart the legendary 1962 escape from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary.
Which, honestly, is just wild.
It remains, one of the most enduring, fiercely debated mysteries in American history, and we are going really depth today.
Oh, we are. We have been scouring 17 years worth of declassified FBI case files. 17 years.
Yeah, the stack of documents is massive. We've pulled the original architectural and engineering schematics of the prison itself.
And we're not just looking at the old paper files. We're bringing in modern science.
Right.
Specifically, there's this fascinating hydrodynamic study from Delft University in the Netherlands.
Right, alongside a mountain of recent forensic analysis. Now, I should mention, there are a lot of contradictory reports in these files.
Oh, totally. It's a mess.
You have conflicting FBI memos, you have theories involving notorious organized crime figures, and just endless speculation.
So much speculation. But we need to make it clear, we are here strictly as impartial reporters of the text.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any specific controversial claim or political angle.
Right. We are just laying out the mechanics, the evidence, and the raw facts exactly as they appear in the historical record. We want you to be able to piece this massive puzzle together yourself.
Because to truly comprehend the sheer audacity of this escape, you cannot just look at the men who did it.
No, you have to understand the cage that held them. You really have to understand the sheer arrogance of the architecture.
Arrogance is the perfect word for it. Let's rewind to 1934.
Okay, setting the scene. The United States is in the grip of the Great Depression.
Right. And the federal government is fighting a very public, very bloody war on crime. So they take this old military fort on Alcatraz Island.
Which is basically just sitting there in the bay.
Yeah, and they hand it over to the Department of Justice with one mandate: build the ultimate maximum security prison.
The end-all be-all of prison.
Exactly. And they poured $260,000 into modernizing this facility.
Which, in 1934 money, during a historic economic depression, that is a staggering, almost incomprehensible sum.
It really was. And they didn't just throw that money at thicker concrete. They fundamentally re-engineered the environment.
Right, to create something the Bureau of Prisons literally called a concentration model.
Yeah, the modernization was just obsessive in its mechanical detail. For instance, they brought in 4 massive train carloads of highly specialized tool-resistant steel.
4 train carloads. Where do they even get that?
From the Stewart Iron Works in Cincinnati. They used it to construct 269 new cell fronts. And we really need to explain what tool-resistant actually meant in the 1930s.
Yeah, because these weren't just standard iron bars you could just hack away at.
No, not at all. They were engineered with a softer outer layer of steel, but an incredibly hard inner core.
So if a prisoner managed to get a hacksaw blade from somewhere and started sawing,
the blade would bite into that outer layer just fine, but as soon as it hit the inner core, the teeth of the saw would just grind down to nothing. It would destroy the tool.
That is insane. And not only that, but they designed these cylindrical inserts inside the bars that would literally spin.
The spinning bars, yes.
So if you somehow tried to saw through it, the inner bar would just rotate with the blade, right? Giving you absolutely no friction or purchase.
It is just brilliant, deeply paranoid engineering.
I love that. Paranoid engineering.
They even installed these complex mechanical lever systems at the ends of the cell blocks.
Oh, right, for the doors.
Yeah. This allowed the guards to operate the heavy steel doors entirely remotely. They could drop a lever to open a cell without ever having to physically step near an inmate.
Which makes sense. They were designing a system that essentially removed human error from the equation entirely.
Precisely. And they were utilizing absolute cutting-edge technology for the era. Have you seen the stuff about the metal detectors?
The Teletouch Corporation stuff.
Yes, the Teletouch Corporation of New York was contracted to install the very first electronic metal detectors in the country.
Right there on the Alcatraz wharf.
Yeah, and at the entrances to the cell house, these relied on early magnetic anomaly detection.
So if an inmate had, say, a shiv or a piece of metal hidden on them,
It would disrupt the magnetic field generated by the doorway and immediately trigger an alarm.
so the government was basically building a technological marvel.
Yeah.
But the physical security, the steel and the magnets, that was only half the equation.
Right. The underlying philosophy of the rock was far more insidious than just heavy doors.
Oh, absolutely. It was designed from the ground up to be a psychological weapon. That is the core of it.
They wanted to take the most unmanageable public enemies in the country and systematically break them down.
Take Al Capone, for example.
Yeah.
Inmate AZ-85.
The quintessential public enemy.
Right. Before he got to Alcatraz, he was at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. And he basically ran the place like a luxury hotel.
He really did. He had fine bedding. He was having home-cooked meals brought in from outside.
He had the guards on his payroll. I mean, he was still a mob boss, just operating from a different zip code.
But then 1934 rolls around. He steps off the boat onto Alcatraz, and Warden James A. Johnston strips him of everything.
Everything. No contact with the outside world, no privileges, zero influence.
They neutralized him so completely that within a few years, this terrifying, ruthless Chicago crime lord was reduced to playing the banjo in the prison's Sunday band.
Just a guy with a banjo.
Yeah.
They did the exact same thing to George Machine Gun Kelly. They took these larger-than-life figures and just erased their identities.
Because the environment was engineered to enforce an unyielding, crushing routine, in the early years there was a strict code of silence.
You literally could not speak.
Right. Inmates were subjected to 12 official head counts every single day. The predictability was absolute.
Even the plumbing was weaponized. This detail always gets me. The prison administration famously only provided hot water in the showers.
Right, which sounds like a luxury until you realize the physiological reasoning behind it.
Exactly. They figured if the inmates were never exposed to cold water, their bodies could never acclimate to the freezing temperatures of the San Francisco Bay.
So if they ever tried to swim for it, the shock of the 54-degree water would incapacitate them almost instantly.
They thought of absolutely everything. But you know, there is one detail about the psychology of this place that haunts me.
What's that?
I want you to really think about this from the perspective of an inmate. You are trapped in this freezing, damp, concrete box.
Right.
You have zero privacy. You're counted 12 times a day like cattle. But your cell block faces out toward the bay.
Ah, yeah. The view.
And on certain nights, especially around New Year's Eve, the wind would shift and the atmospheric conditions were just right. Former inmates have gone on the record saying they could actually hear the sounds of the city drifting across the water.
They could hear laughter.
Yes, they could hear the music from the yacht clubs in San Francisco. Is the sight of the San Francisco skyline so close you feel like you could touch it, yet absolutely impossible to reach? The ultimate form of psychological torture.
It is the absolute definition of a psychological torment. I mean, you have this vibrant, thriving, free society sitting merely a mile and a half away,
Constantly visible through the bars.
constantly taunting you. Many former guards and inmates noted that this juxtaposition was the hardest thing to endure.
Worse than the silence.
Oh, it tested their sanity way more than the silence or the steel. It was a constant, glaring reminder of everything they had lost and everything they could never have again.
It sounds exactly like a sensory deprivation tank, but one designed specifically to crush the human spirit.
That's a great analogy, actually.
It just makes me wonder, if you apply that much pressure to a human being, does it break them? Or does it forge something else entirely? Can any structure, no matter how much tool-resistant steel or magnetic tech you throw at it, truly defeat human desperation?
Well, the historical record shows that for nearly 30 years the fortress held. It successfully defeated everyone who tried.
Until
It didn't. Because here's the vulnerability of a psychological fortress. It works flawlessly right up until it encounters a psychological anomaly.
a glitch in the matrix.
Exactly. And that brings us to the 4 men who arrived on Alcatraz and looked at this impenetrable machine not as a tomb, but as an engineering puzzle waiting to be solved.
No, I love looking at this roster. because it is essentially a dark mirror version of an elite engineering team.
Right.
It's the anti-Ocean's 11. You have four key players in this plot: Franklin Morris, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, and a man named Alan West.
And the synergy of this group is what made the impossible possible.
Let's break them down.
Let's start with the man the FBI files consistently point to as the grand architect of the escape. Franklin Morris, inmate AZ 1441.
The mastermind.
Morris was an orphan from Washington, D.C. He had this really tragic upbringing, bouncing around the brutal foster care system and juvenile reform school since he was just a kid.
He was a lifelong criminal, but the files note that everyone who interacted with him said he was incredibly quiet.
Quiet, intensely observant, and very affable. But more importantly, Morris possessed a tested genius-level IQ of 133.
Which is huge. He had a profound ability to process complex, spatial, and logistical information.
And crucially, he had a long, documented history of successfully breaking out of other federal prisons.
Right. That is the exact reason he was transferred to Alcatraz in the first place. The Bureau of Prisons viewed him as a flight risk that only the Rock could contain.
So Morris brings the sheer intellectual processing power to the table. He brings the blueprint.
But a blueprint is useless if you don't have the mechanics to build it. And that is where the Anglin brothers come in.
John and Clarence Anglin. They are a massive contrast to Morris's urban, book-smart background.
Oh, complete opposites. They grew up in a massive family of seasonal farm workers down in Florida. They spent their entire childhoods in the deep swamps and the agricultural field.
They were quite literally the MacGyvers of the swamp.
That is the perfect way to put it. Their background is essential to understanding how the execution of this escape actually functioned.
Because their family noted in interviews that, growing up in extreme poverty, they never had the luxury of buying new things.
If something broke, they had to invent a way to fix it with whatever they could find in the dirt.
My absolute favorite detail about their childhood is the bicycle tires.
Oh, the moss. Explain that.
Yes. So if they were riding bikes and punctured a tire, they obviously didn't have money for a patch kit. So John and Clarence would pry the rubber tire off the rim.
And pull Spanish moss down from the swamp trees.
Yes. They'd pack the tire incredibly tight with this dense moss, force it back onto the rim, and it provided enough firm structure that they could keep riding the bike.
That is a very specific type of gritty, hands-on mechanical improvisation. Plus, they were incredibly strong swimmers from years of swimming in the turbulent, gator-infested waters of the Florida swamps.
Which is a skill you definitely need if you're going into the San Francisco Bay. But this specific skill set raises a very important question about the true dynamic of the group.
What do you mean?
For decades, the FBI narrative was that Frank Morris was the sole mastermind and the Anglins were merely his grunts. You know, just the muscle to do the digging. But newer forensic and historical analysis suggests a much more collaborative synergy. The Anglin brothers brought a survivalist ingenuity that Morris simply did not possess.
Oh, for sure. Wait, didn't they do something wild in reform school?
Yes. When the Anglins were younger and spent time in a Florida reform school, they had a documented history of crafting dummy heads out of local materials to place in their beds so they could sneak out at night.
Stop right there. That is unbelievable.
It's totally true.
So the very psychological trick that eventually defeated the Alcatraz headcounts and bought them the time to escape was actually a childhood prank from a Florida reform school.
Exactly. It was a technique they had already field-tested as kids.
That is wild.
When you combine Morris's high-level strategic planning with the Anglin's deep well of improvisational swamp survival skills, you get a perfect storm. They complemented each other's blind spots flawlessly.
And we absolutely cannot forget Alan West. West is the catalyst for the whole thing.
He really is the one who initiates the sequence.
He was assigned to a painting and maintenance detail on the top tier of B block, right?
Yeah, and because he was up there painting, he had a vantage point that the other inmates just didn't have. He noticed that the ventilation shafts leading up to the roof were not made of the same tool-resistant steel as the cell bars.
They were just standard iron grills, surrounded by deteriorating concrete. So he brings this observation to the Anglins bring in Morris, and boom, the cell is activated.
So the target is identified. The vents at the back of their individual cells.
Let's talk about these vents.
They measured about 6 by 9 inches and were covered by an iron grill. Behind that grill was an unguarded utility corridor.
Just a narrow, pitch-dark space between the cell blocks.
Exactly. Filled with a complex labyrinth of plumbing pipes, electrical conduits, and heating ducts that ran vertically all the way up to the ceiling of the massive cell house.
So the logic is, if they could get through the wall, They would have a hidden highway straight to the roof.
But there is a glaring problem. You are in a maximum security prison. You do not have access to jackhammers, masonry saws, or sledgehammer.
Right. So how do you carve through reinforced concrete silently, right under the noses of the guards?
Which brings us to the preparation phase, which took a staggering 6 months.
I want to spend time really marveling at the craft here, because how they turned a sterile concrete box into a clandestine manufacturing laboratory just defies belief. It really does.
It begins with the most rudimentary tools imaginable. They start by stealing metal spoons from the mess hall.
Just normal eating spoons.
Yeah, they break the handles off and sharpen the edges on the rough concrete of their cell floors to create crude chisels.
Talk about patience.
And whenever they had recreation time out in the yard, they would scour the ground and occasionally find a discarded piece of a hacksaw blade from the prison's own maintenance crews.
So they'd smuggle these tiny metal shards back in their clothing. But chiseling through concrete with the spoon handle is agonizingly slow. Morris realizes they need power.
They need mechanization.
And this is where my jaw hits the floor. They realize they need a drill. So what do? They steal the motor out of a vacuum cleaner.
Yes, a vacuum motor.
Now, I need you to explain the mechanics of this, because it's not like you just plug a vacuum cleaner in and it starts drilling holes in concrete. How do you convert a 1960s vacuum cleaner into a functional masonry drill?
It is an incredible feat of improvised engineering. A vacuum cleaner motor is essentially just a high-speed rotary engine. They managed to extract the motor core itself.
Okay.
But to make it a drill, you need a chuck. Something to actually hold a drill bit.
Right, otherwise it's just a spinning metal stick.
Exactly. They used stolen materials, likely pieces of metal conduit and wire, to fashion a makeshift chuck onto the spinning armature of the motor. Then they took those tiny shards of stolen saw blades and embedded them into the chuck.
So now, when the motor spins,
it violently rotates the saw blade, allowing it to grind away the concrete much faster than hand chiseling.
But wait, a vacuum motor is deafening. If you turn on a vacuum in a giant echoing concrete cell block, every single guard in the facility is going to hear it immediately. How did they not get caught the second they turned it on?
They solved that in 2 ways. First, they built a custom acoustic housing for the motor.
Out of what?
They used cardboard, blankets, and whatever soft material they could scavenge to wrap the motor tightly. This muffled the high-frequency whine of the spinning parts.
That's smart, but that can't be enough to hide the noise entirely.
No, the true stroke of genius was their understanding of the prison's own schedule. They utilized the daily music hour.
Oh, the music hour.
Every evening, around 5:30 p.m., the prison allowed inmates who owned stringed instruments or accordions to play them in their cells.
Right, and in a massive concrete building with steel bars everywhere, the acoustics are absolutely chaotic. The sound waves just bounce relentlessly off every hard surface, creating this thick wall of ambient noise.
Exactly. The ambient din of dozens of instruments echoing off the concrete completely deafened the guards on patrol. It was a cacophony.
And Frank Morris recognized this acoustic shield.
He did. He actually used money from his personal prison trust fund to order an accordion. Not because he wanted to learn to play it,
but because the loud, reedy frequency of an accordion perfectly masked the low, grinding frequency of their improvised electric drill.
He would sit in his cell, loudly pumping this accordion, while the Anglin brothers were literally drilling through the concrete wall right next door.
That is just brilliant. They weaponized the prison's one concession to entertainment.
So over 6 months, they drill an interlocking series of holes closely together around the perimeter of the iron vent grills.
Like perforating a piece of paper.
Exactly. Once the holes are drilled, they can simply pop the entire concrete section out in one piece. The hole is now wide enough to squeeze a human body through.
But they can't just leave a gaping hole in the wall during the day. The guards would see it instantly.
No, the visual deception was just as vital as the physical breach. They crafted fake vent covers out of cardboard scavenged from the prison workshops.
And they painted them, right?
Yeah, they used green paint stolen from the art supply room to match the exact shade of the cell walls, and they drew the grills with black ink.
So in the dim, recessed lighting of the cells, a guard walking rapidly past during a head count would look in, see the green wall and the black grates.
And his brain would register everything as totally normal.
So they have access. Night after night, they squeeze through the holes, place the fake cardboard vents back in place behind them to hide their absence, and they are standing in the utility corridor.
From there, they climb up the network of pipes about 30 feet high and realize that the very top of the cell block, the roof inside the building, is completely vacant.
The guards never go up there.
Never. It is totally unmonitored. This vacant space becomes their secret workshop. They set up a system where one man acts as a lookout while the others work.
They even built a homemade periscope out of scavenged glass and cardboard so the lookout could peer around the corners of the cell block and watch the guards' patrol routes from above without exposing his head.
It's just phenomenal situational awareness. And it is in this secret, elevated workshop that they undertake their most impossible task.
Which brings me to the prompt I am most excited to discuss today. How do you hide a raft made of 50 raincoats in a prison where you have zero privacy?
It speaks volumes about the thriving, invisible underground economy of Alcatraz. Inmates had a complex barter system.
Over several months, Morris and the Anglins systematically stole, traded cigarettes for, or were donated more than 50 standard-issue olive green rubberized raincoats.
Because the inventory control by the guards was flawed, inmates would wear their raincoats out to the recreation yard when it was drizzling. They would purposefully leave them behind on a bench.
And a guard wouldn't notice. Later, an inmate working a yard detail would smuggle the coat inside and hand it off to the crew.
So they amassed 50 raincoats in this roof workshop. And they didn't just tie them in a knot. They engineered a seaworthy vessel.
They hand-stitched these heavy rubber coats together to form the shape of a pontoon raft, roughly 6 feet wide and 14 feet long.
But stitching isn't watertight. Water will rush right through the thread hole, so they had to seal it.
They scraped the waterproof rubber coating off the excess edges of the coats. Then, they held these rubber shavings against the hot steam pipes that ran through the utility corridor.
The intense heat from the steam pipes allowed them to vulcanize the seams.
And we should explain vulcanization in this context.
Yes, it is a chemical process. Normally, rubber is a tangle of polymer chains that can easily pull apart. But when you apply intense heat, those chains cross-link.
Right, melting the separate pieces of rubber into one continuous, incredibly strong, watertight sheet.
They essentially turned a prison utility shaft into a miniature rubber curing facility. They also fortified the seams using a liquid plastic book repair adhesive called Remweld,
which they systematically stole ounce by ounce from the prison library. I just can't get over the fact that they knew how to do this. They didn't invent the vulcanization process in a vacuum. Where did they learn the exact temperature and mechanics needed to cure rubber?
from the prison's own library.
The irony.
When the FBI investigated the aftermath, they found that the inmates had meticulously studied an article in the March 1962 issue of Popular Mechanics magazine.
And what was the article called?
It was ironically titled, "Your Life Preserver, How Will It Behave If You Need It?" They also found inspiration in technical diagrams from an issue of Sports Illustrated.
So the prison was providing them with the exact engineering manuals they needed to escape right under the guards' noses. The audacity is staggering.
They even solved the inflation problem.
Oh, right, because you can't blow up a 14-foot pontoon raft with your lungs. You'd pass out.
So they took that same accordion that Morse used to mask the drilling noise, removed the musical keys, and converted the central concertina section into a high-capacity mechanical bellows.
Once they reached the water, they could aggressively pump the accordion to inflate the massive raft in a matter of minutes. It is a masterclass in mechanical brilliance.
It is. But as brilliant as the raft and the tools were, none of it mattered if they didn't have a head start.
Right. If a guard noticed they were missing at the 9:30 p.m. head count, the alarm would sound, the island would go into lockdown, and the bay would be swarming with Coast Guard cutters before they even inflated the raft.
To launch this vessel, to navigate the lethal barbed wire fences and the armed gun towers, they needed hours of uninterrupted time. And to buy that time, they needed the ultimate decoy.
This is where we see the absolute peak of their psychological manipulation.
Yeah.
The decoy strategy.
They had to defeat the visual inspection of the guards during the night patrols. So they decided to create incredibly realistic dummy heads to place on their pillows, simulating sleeping figures.
But again, you don't have access to clay or modeling plaster in Alcatraz. You have to invent the clay.
The chemistry of the dummy heads is fascinating. They crushed up standard-issue prison bar soap.
They mixed that soap powder with toothpaste, the concrete dust they had saved from drilling out their vents, and toilet paper.
When you mix these elements with a little water, the moisture evaporates slowly, and the concrete dust acts as a binding agent with the soap,
creating a highly malleable papier-mâché paste that eventually cures into a rigid, solid form.
Exactly. They sculpted this paste into the exact anatomical shapes of their own heads. They captured the brow lines, the cheekbones, the noses.
Then they acquired flesh-tone paint, likely smuggled from the prison maintenance shop, to color the faces. But a painted soap head still looks like a painted soap head.
Right, it lacks texture. The detail that truly sold the illusion, the absolute masterstroke of this entire plan, was the hair.
Yes, the hair. Clarence Anglin had managed to get assigned to a work detail in the prison barber shop.
And for months, as he swept the floor, he meticulously gathered up real human hair. He would sort it by color, matching the shades to his brother's, and Morris's hair.
He smuggled pockets full of this hair back to the cells, and they painstakingly glued it to the crowns, the eyebrows, and the eyelashes of these dummy heads. That is just wild.
Think about the psychological conditioning of the guards here. It is late at night. The main cell house lights are dimmed down to almost nothing. The guards are walking the tiers, doing their counts.
And the guards have been conditioned by the rigid routine to expect to see the exact same thing every single night. A lump under the blankets and a tuft of hair sticking out near the pillow.
The inmates knew this. They piled extra towels and clothing under their heavy wool blankets to simulate the shape of a torso. They placed these incredibly realistic heads on the pillows and purposefully turned them slightly toward the wall.
It perfectly exploits a concept known as confirmation bias.
Exactly. The human brain, especially when fatigued during a night shift, doesn't actually process every detail. It looks for familiar patterns.
The guard sees the wool blanket, sees the shadow of a head, sees the real human hair reflecting the dim light, and his brain automatically registers sleeping inmate.
The prison administration relied on a rigid, predictable routine to break the inmates' spirits. But that same rigid predictability gave Morris and the Anglins the exact blueprint of what the guards expected to see.
They turned the prison's greatest psychological weapon entirely against it. It worked flawlessly. The illusion was so perfectly executed that no one noticed they were gone all night.
The dummies weren't discovered until 7 a.m. the next morning.
And there is this incredibly vivid, almost cinematic detail from the declassified FBI files. The morning after the escape, Officer Bill Long is walking the tier for the wake-up count.
The morning bell has rung, but Clarence Anglin isn't getting out of bed.
Officer Long thinks he's just sleeping in. So he walks up to the steel bars, reaches his hand through, and physically pushes the side of Clarence's head to wake him up.
And as he pushes it, he watches in absolute sheer shock as the head detaches from the body, rolls off the pillow, falls onto the concrete floor, and shatters its nose.
Can you imagine the sheer icy panic that must have gripped that guard's mind in that split second?
The sudden realization that the impenetrable vault you have been guarding is empty. It must have been terrifying.
Which brings us to the actual execution phase, the breakout itself, the night of June 11th, 1962.
Let's lay out the timeline of that night. 9:30 p.m., the final lights out bell rings. The prison goes silent.
The dummy heads are carefully placed onto the pillows. The towels are arranged under the blankets. The men slip backwards through the holes in their cell walls, pulling the painted cardboard grills tightly into place behind them.
They are now standing in the dark, narrow utility corridor. The adrenaline must have been astronomical.
But immediately, within minutes of launching the operation, a catastrophic failure occurs. Things go terribly wrong for Alan West.
Yes, Alan West, the man who originally spotted the vulnerability in the vents, is suddenly trapped in his own cell.
Oh no, how?
Well, over the previous weeks, to hide his aggressive digging from the guards, West had used a bit of wet cement stolen from a construction detail to camouflage the crumbling concrete around his vent.
Okay.
But he fundamentally miscalculated the chemistry of the cement. It hydroreactively cured. It hardened far beyond his expectations, shrinking the opening and fixing his iron grill firmly in place.
So he is frantically chipping away at this hardened cement in pitch blackness, trying to break through. Morris and the Anglin brothers are standing in the utility corridor on the other side of the wall, waiting for him.
But the clock is ruthlessly ticking. Every single minute they wait for West is a minute closer to the dawn, closer to the sun coming up and exposing them on the roof.
They are forced to make an incredibly brutal, split-second tactical decision. They abandon West. They leave him behind in his cell.
It was a cold but necessary calculation. If they stayed, they all failed.
So the three remaining men haul their heavy, bulky gear, the 50 raincoat raft, the wooden paddles they carved, the improvised life, vests up the 30 feet of intricate plumbing pipes to the roof workshop.
From there, they had to breach the final barrier, the main roof ventilator.
They had prepared for this weeks earlier by using their makeshift tools to pry the heavy iron rivets out of the fan motor housing, temporarily holding the heavy structure in place with fake bolts they had carefully carved out of soap.
They pop the soap bolts out, force the massive ventilator open, and squeeze through. They climb out onto the flat roof of the main cell house.
Now, according to the files, the guards actually reported hearing a loud metallic crash around this time. But because the wind was howling and no other noises followed, the guards dismissed it and didn't investigate.
The men are now on the roof, fully exposed to the night sky and the sweeping beams of the searchlights.
They traverse the roof to the rear of the cell house, where they find a massive bakery smokestack. They wrap their arms and legs around this exterior pipe and undergo a terrifying, friction-burning 50-foot slide down to the ground.
And even at the bottom of the smokestack, they aren't free. They're still inside the perimeter. They have to carefully navigate the shadows, avoiding the overlapping grid of the guard tower spotlights.
They scale two separate 12-foot-high fences, topped with razor-sharp barbed wire, carrying all of this heavy rubberized equipment until they finally reach the northeast shore of the island, right near the prison's power plant.
This specific location by the power plant is crucial to the entire operation. It was a known blind spot in the prison's defense network.
If you think about the searchlights and the armed gun towers as a geometric grid, this spot was a radar shadow. The angles of the lights simply could not reach it.
It's like standing in a tiny pocket of safety while total chaos and deadly force swirl all around you.
One wrong step outside that shadow, one beam of light catching the reflection of a zipper, and the tower guards are authorized to open fire immediately with .3 Chat caliber rifles.
But huddled in that tiny dark blind spot, they pull out the converted accordion bellows, attach it to the valves of the raincoat raft, and frantically begin pumping.
According to the complex estimations made by the FBI and subsequent hydrodynamic studies of the bay, they likely completed inflation and hit the freezing water somewhere between 10:00 p.m. and 10:03 p.m.
And from this exact precise moment, the moment rubber touched water, the historical record shatters. History splits into two fiercely contested, wildly divergent narratives.
This is where we have to debate the ending. Did Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin survive the night? We are going to look at both sides of this coin. Let's start with the official institutional narrative.
The skeptic's case.
Right. Why did the FBI finally close this massive file in 1979 and officially conclude that these three genius escapees died a brutal death in the San Francisco Bay?
Well, the FBI's conclusion is deeply rooted in the sheer, unforgiving, deadly reality of the physical environment.
The water.
The water in the San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11, 1962 was an icy 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The bay is notorious for its massive, sweeping tidal currents that funnel billions of gallons of water through the narrow Golden Gate straight out into the violent Pacific Ocean.
Okay.
The FBI's 17-year investigation concluded that the men, exhausted from the breakout, simply succumbed to profound hypothermia. Their muscles locked up, the makeshift raft failed, and they drowned, their bodies swept miles out to sea by the rapid ebb tide.
Okay, that is the theory of the environment. But where is the hard physical evidence of that outcome?
The ocean itself provided the evidence. 3 days later, on June 14th, a Coast Guard cutter patrolling the bay found a wooden paddle floating about 200 yards off the southern shore of Angel Island, which is north of Alcatraz.
The paddle.
On that exact same day, civilian workers on a boat found a rubber-wrapped packet floating in the water nearby. When they opened it, they found a wallet containing family photos, names, and addresses belonging directly to the Anglin brothers.
Okay.
Then, a week later, on June 24th, one of the homemade raincoat life vests washed up on Cronkite Beach, which is nearly 3 miles completely outside the Golden Gate Bridge, facing the open ocean.
I hear that, but finding a discarded wallet and a loose paddle doesn't definitively mean they drowned. If anything, it proves the raft was buoyant and made it at least part of the way.
Perhaps, but you have to consider the most chilling piece of circumstantial evidence, which occurred a month later, on July 17th.
The Norwegian freighter.
Yes. The SS Norfjell. It was sailing 15 miles out past the Golden Gate Bridge, deep in the open Pacific. The crew spotted a body floating face down in the water. They reported to authorities that the body was wearing what looked exactly like denim trousers, the specific, distinct material of the Alcatraz prison uniforms.
But they didn't recover the body.
They couldn't because the ship lacked cold storage facilities. But that sighting strongly supports the mathematical theory that the bodies were swept out to sea.
What about the land search?
That's the other behavioral evidence. Alan West, who was left behind, told the FBI during interrogations that their master plan was to reach the mainland, immediately break into a house to steal civilian clothes, and hotwire a car to get out of the state.
The FBI issued a massive nationwide alert based on that.
Right, but despite scouring every police blotter in the state, the FBI confirmed that absolutely no cars or clothes were reported stolen in Marin County or San Francisco that night. No bodies were found on land, and no crimes were committed to aid their flight. Therefore, they never made it to land.
Okay, yeah. That is a very solid, logical, official narrative. But I am going to aggressively push back on this because the believer's case, the theory that they survived, is absolutely packed with modern science and overlooked evidence that the FBI either ignored, buried, or simply got wrong.
All right, let's hear it.
Let's tackle the cold water first. You said 54 degrees is lethal. Yes, it is, but they knew that. Whitey Bulger, the infamous Boston mob boss who was actually incarcerated at Alcatraz at the same time, later went on the record claiming he was friends with the Anglins.
He said he gave them advice, right?
Yes, explicit advice based on his own military SQUB training. He told them to train for the shock. For months, the men would plug their cell sinks, fill them with freezing water, soak their towels in it, wrap the freezing towels tightly around their bodies, and lie on the bare concrete floor.
Wow.
They were systematically, physiologically acclimating their cardiovascular systems to the freezing temperatures. They were prepared for the thermal shock.
I mean, acclimating in a static, dry cell is a vastly different physiological experience than surviving a mile-and-a-half paddle in a chaotic, churning 54-degree tidal current in the pitch black.
True, but what about the integrity of the raft? The FBI assumed it failed. But the show Mythbusters actually tackled this.
I thought we remember that.
They procured the exact same 1960s raincoat materials, used the exact same vulcanization methods and Remweld glue, built the raft, and paddled it across the bay in similar conditions. They proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the raincoat raft was structurally seaworthy.
It held up.
But let's elevate this to actual hard science. In 2014, a team of highly credentialed Dutch scientists from Delft University, experts in flood risk and hydrodynamics, decided to map the exact tidal vectors of the bay on that specific night.
Yes, the Delft hydrodynamic study is a phenomenal piece of computer modeling.
It is.
They fed the historical bathymetry of the bay, the lunar cycles, and the exact tidal flow data from June 11th, 1962 into a particle tracking simulation. And the simulation showed that if the men launched their raft at 10 p.m., as the FBI estimated, the incredibly strong ebb tide pulling out of the bay would have caught them, dragged them directly toward the Golden Gate Bridge, and swept them violently out into the Pacific Ocean.
Which perfectly aligns with the Norwegian freighter spotting a body 15 miles out.
Exactly.
Ah, but you are leaving out the most critical revelation of the Delft study. The Dutch scientists proved that the 10 p.m. launch was deadly. Yes. But if Morris and the Anglin simply waited in that radar shadow blind spot by the power plant, if they possessed the patience to sit freezing in the dark for just 1 extra hour and launched at exactly 11:30 p.m., the simulation shows something miraculous.
The tidal shift.
Yes. At 11:30 p.m., the tides began to shift. The current would have perfectly, gently pushed their raft directly north, depositing them safely onto the shores of the Marin headlands just after midnight.
It's a very narrow window.
And the most brilliant, mind-blowing part of the study, it proved that if they made landfall at Marin and discarded their gear in the water to hide their tracks, the changing flood tide would have caught that debris, pulled it backward into the bay, and deposited the paddle and the wallet precisely where the Coast Guard found them near Angel Island.
So the debris...
The debris wasn't evidence of a catastrophic drowning. The physics of the bay prove it was the discarded trash of a perfectly executed, successful landing.
It is an incredibly compelling mathematical model, I'll give you that. But it relies heavily on the assumption that these men, who had been locked in concrete boxes for years, possessed an intimate, almost nautical expert-level knowledge of the bay's complex tidal schedules.
They were absolute geniuses. Morris had a 133 IQ. Figuring out a lunar tide chart from library books is exactly what he would do.
It also assumes they had the iron discipline to sit freezing in a blind spot for an hour and a half while knowing the alarms could sound at any given second.
But let me rapid-fire the modern clues, because the physical evidence didn't stop in the 1960s. Let's talk about the 1975 photograph.
Oh, the Brazil photo.
The Anglin family, who always maintained the brothers survived, received a photograph from a family friend named Fred Britzi. The photo shows two men with very distinct facial features standing by a massive termite mound on a rural farm in Brazil.
I've seen it.
Independent forensic analysts have run this photo through modern facial recognition software, measuring the biometric distances between the eyes, the nose, and the jawline. The software concluded it is a highly probable biometric match for John and Clarence Anglin, aged appropriately for 1975.
You have to view that photo with severe caution, though.
Why?
The U.S. Marshal Service, who inherited the case from the FBI, has formally stated that the age, the graininess, and the degraded condition of the photo, combined with the fact that both men are wearing large sunglasses obscuring key facial markers, makes a definitive legal biometric identification impossible.
Okay, fair enough. But what about the 2013 letter?
The San Francisco Police Department letter.
Yes. The SFPD received a handwritten letter that explicitly stated, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely."
A very bold claim.
The writer explicitly offered to surrender himself to authorities in exchange for exactly 1 year of medical care for his cancer. The FBI took this incredibly seriously. They tested the paper for DNA, they tested it for trace fingerprints, and they analyzed the handwriting.
And the results were inconclusive.
Exactly. Inconclusive. They could not legally declare it a fake, not a hoax. Inconclusive.
But you must acknowledge that hoaxes have plagued this specific investigation since day one. The literal day after the escape, an anonymous person called a prominent San Francisco law firm claiming to be John Anglin.
True.
A few weeks later, postcards arrived at the FBI headquarters reading, "Ha ha ha, we made it." This case is a massive magnet for tall tales and grifters seeking attention.
I acknowledge the hoaxes. But I cannot ignore the police records. Remember how the FBI definitively stated that no cars were stolen, proving they didn't make it to land?
Yes.
That is simply not true. Investigative journalists later uncovered local police blotters from Marin County that the FBI either missed or actively buried. A 1955 blue Chevy sedan was reported stolen in Marin County that very morning.
Interesting.
And even more compelling, the following day, a motorist in Stockton, California, which is about 80 miles east of San Francisco, directly on an escape route, filed a panicked police report stating he was aggressively forced off the road by a speeding blue Chevy.
A blue Chevy.
And who was driving? He reported it was 3 men wearing blue dungarees, the exact description of the Alcatraz inmates in a stolen car. The FBI swept that report under the rug because it completely dismantled their neat, tidy drowning narrative.
The contradictory evidence is exactly what makes this the ultimate cold case.
It really is.
But if we step back from the intense debate over whether their bodies were swept out to the Pacific or whether they quietly retired to a farm in South America, we have to look at the broader systemic implications of the mystery itself.
What do you mean?
Because regardless of whether they took their next breath on land or inhaled water, the uncertainty of their fate is what ultimately brought down the impenetrable fortress.
Which is the perfect pivot. Less than a year after this spectacular, mind-bending escape, on March 21st, 1963, the federal government officially and permanently closed Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The gates were locked for good.
The official rationale given by the Department of Justice was heavily rooted in cold economics and logistical nightmares. The facility was an absolute financial black hole to maintain.
How bad was it?
By 1963, it cost roughly $10 per day per inmate to operate Alcatraz. To put that in perspective, it cost just $3 a day to house an inmate at the maximum security federal prison in Atlanta.
More than triple the cost.
Because Alcatraz was an island, absolutely everything had to be shipped in. They had no fresh water source. The government was barging 1 million gallons of fresh water to the island every single week just to run the showers, flush the toilets, and cook the meals.
And it wasn't just the water. The island itself was actively fighting back against the architecture.
Right, the environment was destroying it.
The severe salt air and the harsh, constant maritime winds had eroded the concrete walls so badly that the structural integrity of the main cell houses was critically failing. The salt moisture seeped into the concrete, rusted the internal steel rebar, and caused the concrete to literally explode outward.
A process called spalling.
Yes, spalling. That structural rot is exactly why the concrete was crumbling so easily around the inmates' air vents in the first place.
The Bureau of Prisons brought in engineers who estimated that they needed an immediate injection of between $3 million and $5 million just in basic masonry repairs.
Just to keep the cell block roofs from literally collapsing into the bay.
The financial burden was undeniably massive. But the historical timing of the closure simply cannot be ignored. The 1962 escape fundamentally, irreversibly shattered the myth of the rock.
It shattered the illusion.
For nearly 30 years, the federal government had touted Alcatraz as the inescapable ultimate solution to America's crime problem. It wasn't just a prison, it was a potent symbol of absolute, terrifying federal authority. It was designed to be the vault that could never be cracked.
So I have to ask you the ultimate question here. Looking at the sheer mechanical brilliance of what Morris and the Anglins pulled off, if they made it to shore, if they actually survived that freezing water, does that definitively prove that absolutely no vault, no matter how much steel you pour into it, is truly uncrackable?
I believe it proves a fundamental truth about security. Human ingenuity will always eventually outpace static defense. A wall cannot think, but the person trapped behind it has 24 hours a day to study its flaws. The physical structure of Alcatraz was already crumbling from the salt air, but the legend of the 1962 escape delivered the fatal psychological blow to the institution.
They defeated the idea of Alcatraz.
Think about it. Even if those 3 men drowned in the bay 10 minutes after launching their rubber raft, they still successfully defeated the concept of the prison. They proved you could beat the uncrackable steel. They proved you could outsmart the magnetic detectors and the 12 daily counts. They proved you could break out of the box.
And once that aura of complete invulnerability was destroyed, the staggering financial cost of keeping the crumbling prison open became politically impossible to justify. The myth was dead. That is incredibly profound. So whether their lungs filled with the freezing waters of the Pacific Ocean on that dark June night, or whether they actually lived out their golden years quietly growing marijuana on a rural farm in Brazil, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin achieved a completely different, unassailable kind of immortality.
They did.
They didn't just escape a prison. They became the ghosts that forever haunted the American penal system.
And it is worth noting that their arrest warrants remain highly active with the U.S. Marshal Service to this very day. The investigation remains open. The hunt has never officially ended.
It is an absolutely incredible story of sheer desperation colliding with profound genius. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the archives, I want to leave you with a chilling, lingering thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
The FBI, the Coast Guard, and the U.S. Marshals spent decades scouring the vastness of the world for 3 missing men. They dragged the ocean floor, they interviewed mobsters, they sent agents deep into South America, and they chased down hundreds of dead-end leads.
A massive manhunt.
But perhaps the most profound, terrifying evidence of unstoppable human willpower wasn't found floating in the churning ocean, and it wasn't found in a photograph from a jungle in Brazil. It was found on the morning of June 12th, left gently behind on a prison cot.
The dummy head.
A smiling, perfectly sculpted face made of stolen soap, concrete dust, and real human hair, staring blindly up at a baffled guard. A silent, grinning monument, proving to the world that the human mind can break out of any cage long before the body ever does. Keep questioning everything, and we will see you on the next deep dive.